when the gates of the concentration camps finally swung open at the end of the Second World War, the liberating Allied forces and medical teams, they really expected to find this overwhelming, unadulterated joy.
Right. I mean, that's the natural assumption.
Exactly. They assumed that just removing this unspeakable industrialized horror would instantly result in profound relief. But instead, they walked into this psychological landscape that just defied all conventional medical logic.
It completely broke the models they had.
Yeah, it did. They found survivors who were just utterly incapable of feeling pleasure. They found an immediate, highly dangerous epidemic of severe moral deformation, where victims suddenly sought to become oppressors.
Which is so hard to comprehend from the outside.
It is. And they found this crushing wave of disillusionment and depression. It turns out the moment the physical suffering stopped was the moment the most complex psychological danger actually began.
Because the human mind, it can build this incredible, almost impenetrable fortress to survive sustained trauma. But when the siege suddenly ends and those walls are no longer needed, that mental architecture doesn't just neatly pack itself away. It collapses inward.
Wow.
Yeah, the return to so-called normalcy is often the most lethal phase of survival.
Welcome to the deep dive. We know you are here because you want the whole picture. You want the deep underlying mechanisms behind the facts without drowning in the information overload.
And today is a heavy one.
It really is. Today, we are immersing ourselves in one of the most profoundly terrifying, yet ultimately hopeful, psychological texts of the 20th century.
Viktor Frankl's monumental 1946 book, Man's Search for Meaning.
If you've been following psychology for, any amount of time, you already know this book is an absolute giant. We are talking about a text that has sold over 16 million copies, been translated into 52 languages, and was named one of the 10 most influential books in the United States by the Library of Congress.
It is just entirely ubiquitous in modern psychological discourse. But what frequently gets lost in those pop culture citations is the raw, unsterilized context of its creation.
Yeah, people forget where it came from.
Exactly. The original German title wasn't this uplifting aphorism. It was published as a psychologist experiences the concentration camp.
That paints a very different picture.
It really does. It was only later that they added the prefix "say yes to life" nonetheless. And even that addition carries a heavy weight, because that specific phrase was inspired by a song.
Wait, a song?
Yeah, Das Buchenwald-Lied. It was written by a prisoner actively suffering inside the Buchenwald concentration camp.
Oh, wow. That completely changes how you read that title.
Huh.
Now, our mission for this deep dive, we aren't just doing a summary of Frankl's harrowing timeline today. You can read a historical timeline anywhere.
Right, there are plenty of resources for that.
Our goal is to extract the core operational mechanics of the psychological framework he forged in the mud and freezing cold of those camps.
The framework he called logotherapy.
Yes. We are going to break down the underlying logic of how he applied those tenets to the everyday, modern existential crises that you and I face. And, crucially, we are going to explore the fierce, intense academic pushback and the controversies surrounding his methods that rarely make it into the mainstream conversation.
Because treating this book merely as an inspirational memoir really does a disservice to the rigorous clinical theory Frankl was trying to build.
Definitely.
To understand the actual utility of logotherapy, we have to stress test it. We have to look at its blind spots, the friction it caused within the scientific community, and the very real concerns about authoritarianism and survival bias that critics have leveled against it.
Okay, let's unpack this. We have to start with the crucible itself. We cannot separate Frankl's clinical conclusions from his trauma because his entire theory was forged in the fire of the Nazi concentration camps.
Right, they're completely intertwined.
So we need to establish the baseline of who he was before the world collapsed.
Well, before the outbreak of the war, Viktor Frankl was not a blank slate. He was already a highly established, deeply educated neurologist and psychiatrist working in Vienna.
A true intellectual.
Very much so. He was born in 1905, earned his medical degree in 1930, and was actively moving in the exact same high-level intellectual circles as the giants of early 20th century psychology.
Right.
He was treating suicidal patients, developing theories on depression, and living a life entirely dedicated to the mind. He was, by all accounts, a man of civilization and intellect.
And then the Nazi regime stripped away every single layer of that civilization. He wasn't just removed from his practice, he was thrown into the abyss.
Yeah.
He was sent to a series of camps, including Auschwitz. And the sheer magnitude of his personal loss is almost impossible to comprehend. He lost his mother, his father, his brother, and his wife to the Holocaust.
It's just devastating.
It is. The sources we are working from detail a physical existence that degrades the very concept of humanity. He endured freezing European winters without proper clothing or shoes. He suffered from severe edema, frostbitten toes, chronic starvation, and lived in barracks completely infested with vermin.
And, all of this was compounded by the psychological torture of the environment.
The constant fear.
Exactly. The constant hovering threat of arbitrary execution. He watched people dropping dead daily from typhus, from malnutrition, or simply being pulled out of a line and murdered for absolutely no logical reason.
Just complete unpredictability.
It was an ecosystem designed specifically not just for physical eradication, but for the systematic dismantling of human identity.
Which places Frankl in a unique, almost paradoxical position, right?
How do you mean?
Well, he was a victim suffering this absolute degradation, but his brain was still wired as a trained clinical psychiatrist. He couldn't turn off his observational skills. He was experiencing the destruction of the human psyche while simultaneously cataloging it. He watched how the human mind reorganizes itself when you remove every basic element of safety.
He really was treating the concentration camp as a gruesome, involuntary psychological laboratory.
That's a dark way to put it, but it's true.
And by synthesizing his clinical observations of the thousands of inmates around him, he identified 3 distinct chronological psychological phases that the prisoners experienced.
Okay, let's go through those.
Understanding the underlying mechanisms of these 3 stages is the absolute prerequisite for understanding everything he built later. So the first stage he identified is shock.
Shock.
Yes, which occurs immediately during the initial admission phase to the camp.
Shock seems like the obvious reaction, but let's dig into the mechanics of that. It wasn't just a sense of being startled, was it?
No, not at all.
The sources describe it as an acute inability for the brain to process reality.
Because the human brain relies on predictive models. It takes past experiences and uses them to anticipate the future.
Right, to keep us safe.
Exactly. So when a prisoner was suddenly thrust into Auschwitz, the environment was so completely hostile, so entirely outside the bounds of human experience, that the brain's predictive models simply shattered.
It just broke down.
The initial shock manifests as this desperate delusion of reprieve.
Like a psychological holding pattern.
Precisely. It is a cognitive defense mechanism where the condemned man, right before his execution, genuinely convinces himself he might be pardoned at the very last millisecond.
Wow.
The brain temporarily suspends reality because processing the truth of the gas chambers would cause an immediate psychological collapse.
It's trying to protect itself.
But the brain cannot maintain that delusion indefinitely. The sensory input of violence and death eventually overwhelms the cognitive block.
The reality leaks in.
The delusion shatters and the prisoner is forced to adapt. And this necessitates the transition into the second stage, which is apathy, or what Frankl termed emotional death.
Emotional death. That phrase just carries such a heavy, morbid tone. But when we look at the biology and the psychology of a concentration camp, emotional death wasn't a failure of character, was it?
Not even a little bit.
It was an essential survival mechanism.
It was an absolute biological imperative. Think about it. If you are in an environment where your friends are being beaten to death in front of you, where thousands are starving, where the cruelty is infinite.
Feeling all of that would destroy you.
Yes. Feeling the full, natural emotional weight of every single tragedy would burn out your nervous system in a matter of hours. Empathy requires immense cognitive and emotional energy.
And in a camp, energy is calories.
And calories are the difference between life and death.
So the mind just triages its resources.
Yeah.
It initiates a hard shutdown of the emotional centers.
It's a total shutdown.
The prisoner develops this protective shell, becoming completely numb to the beatings, the disease, and the daily sight of corpses. They start to evaluate every interaction, every object, solely on its utility for immediate biological survival.
The apathy stage reduces the human being to a state of primal efficiency. The focus narrows down to the next scrap of bread, the next watery bowl of soup, or, acquiring a pair of shoes that won't cause fatal blisters.
Just the bare minimum to exist.
Frankl noted that this emotional blunting allowed inmates to walk past a dying friend without a second glance. And not because they were evil, but because the psychological software required for grief had been intentionally uninstalled by the brain to conserve resources.
Which brings us to the third stage. And this is where the narrative takes a sharp turn away from what we might culturally expect.
Yeah, this is the part people don't talk about as much.
Frankl identified the third stage as depersonalization and disillusionment. And the key factor here is that this stage occurs after liberation,
Right.
when the war is over, when they are finally free.
We culturally assume that liberation is this moment of cinematic, unadulterated joy. But Frankl's clinical observations paint a bizarre, deeply disorienting reality. When the camps were finally liberated, the inmates didn't celebrate.
Right.
They physically couldn't. They were trapped in a state of severe anhedonia.
Which is the complete inability to comprehend or experience pleasure.
Yes.
The sources highlight this one specific detail that is just so haunting to me.
Yeah.
The liberated prisoners walked outside the camp gates, into the fields, and they saw flowers.
Oh, right.
But they reported that the flowers seemed completely surreal. They recognized them visually, but there was zero emotional connection. Reality felt like a hologram, like an illusion that the SS guards were going to snatch away at any second.
Because their minds were still heavily fortified in that apathy stage, even though the physical threat had vanished. Frankl noted that the recovery had to start with the physical biology before the psychology could follow.
How so?
The liberated prisoners experienced voracious, animalistic appetites. They were consumed by the compulsion to eat massive quantities of food and sleep for days on end. The body was desperately trying to replenish its physical deficits.
It was operating purely on instinct.
Only after this biological baseline began to stabilize did the mind slowly start to thaw. And Frankl describes this psychological thawing not as a gentle relief, but as a violent bursting of the strange fetters which had restrained the psyche.
That sudden, violent thawing is exactly what makes the transition to safety so treacherous. I keep thinking of the analogy of a deep-sea diver.
Oh, that's a good one.
Right. When you are down in the extreme depths of the ocean, your body is under thousands of pounds of pressure per square inch. You survive because your equipment pressurizes you to match that extreme environment. But if you come up to the surface too fast, the sudden, rapid absence of pressure causes the nitrogen in your blood to boil into bubbles.
You get the bends.
Exactly. You get decompression sickness, and it will literally kill you from the inside out. Frankl actually utilized this exact analogy, but I want to push you on this.
Okay, go ahead.
Why is the mere absence of a threat so neurologically dangerous? Why does the return to normal cause the psyche to self-destruct?
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the psyche under extreme trauma has built a highly specialized, hyper-vigilant architecture designed exclusively to survive infinite cruelty.
Right, it's built for war.
Exactly. Every neural pathway is optimized for a war zone. So when you instantly remove the pressure of that war zone, that highly pressurized psychological architecture has nothing to push against. It collapses outward. Frankl observed a severe, immediate danger of moral deformation during this decompression phase.
Walk us through the mechanics of that deformation. How did it actually manifest in the survivors?
It manifested as a drastic inversion of morality. Some survivors, suddenly released from the intense pressure of being helpless victims, became obsessed with dispensing that same violence onto others.
They became the abusers.
Yes, they felt justified in inflicting pain because of what they had endured. The sudden release of pressure twisted their moral compass. They unconsciously sought to transition from the role of the oppressed to the role of the oppressor.
As a way to feel in control again.
Exactly. It was a twisted method of reclaiming their lost agency. If they could inflict pain, it proved they were no longer helpless.
And even if a survivor managed to navigate that dangerous decompression without losing their moral center, they still had to confront the reality of the society they were returning to, which triggers the final hurdles of this third stage, right? Bitterness and disillusionment.
The bitterness was just deeply isolating. Survivors returned to their hometowns and encountered an outside world that was going about its daily business. They saw a superficiality and a lack of profound feeling in normal people that absolutely disgusted them.
I can't even imagine.
Ordinary citizens who hadn't been in the camps would offer these hollow platitudes saying they, quote-unquote, understood, when they fundamentally could not comprehend the abyss.
And the disillusionment was the final crushing blow. You endure years of torture by holding on to a specific hope. You know, image of your wife, the thought of returning to your childhood home, the idea of a warm meal with your parents.
It's what keeps you putting one foot in front of the other.
But for Frankl and millions of others, they survived the camps only to return home and find nothing. No one was waiting. The family was dead. The house was gone.
This psychological load-bearing pillar that had kept them alive for years simply vanished into thin air. It was the brutal realization that survival does not magically cure the suffering.
It just changes the flavor of it.
Exactly. The pain changes its shape from physical torture to profound existential emptiness.
So we have to pause here and ask the critical question. If the physical conditions strip away your humanity, and the psychological defense mechanisms leave you numb, and the eventual liberation plunges you into disillusionment.
How did anyone survive?
Yes, how did anyone survive this with their mind intact? What was the mechanism that allowed the human psyche to endure the fundamentally unendurable?
That is the pivotal question. It is the bridge between Frankl's lived trauma and the creation of his psychiatric theory. Because as he analyzed the population of the camps, he realized that while the external environmental circumstances were completely 100% out of the prisoner's control.
They had no say in anything.
Right. But there was an internal cognitive domain that remained entirely untouched by the SS guards.
And this realization forms the cornerstone of one of the most famous philosophical observations of the 20th century. Frankl wrote, quote, "Everything can be taken from a man but one thing, the last of the human freedoms, to choose one's attitude in any given set of circumstances."
It's so powerful.
He identified that there is a microscopic gap between a stimulus and a human's response to that stimulus. And in that tiny gap, human freedom exists.
It's a profound, radical shift in perspective. When you are in Auschwitz, you possess zero freedom of movement, you have zero freedom of speech, you have zero bodily autonomy.
Nothing.
The stimulus is constant, overwhelming, unavoidable suffering. But Frankl argued that the internal response to that suffering is not hardwired, it is a conscious choice.
You decide.
You, and you alone, decide what your internal reality will be in the very next moment, even if the only choice you have left is deciding the posture with which you will walk toward the worksite.
He observed that this specific internal choice dictated whether a prisoner ultimately behaved like a swine or a saint. And I really want to dig into this because his observations completely disrupt our standard binary view of good and evil in extreme situations.
They absolutely do.
We like to think society in the camps divided neatly. The Nazi guards were the monsters and the prisoners were the pure, innocent victims. But Frankl pointed out the reality was far more complex.
He argued that humanity is not divided by race or class or even by political affiliation. Frankl observed that society is divided into only two true categories: decent men and indecent men.
Okay. Decent and indecent.
And crucially, no society, no group is completely free of either. In the extreme pressure cooker environment of the camps, the traditional boundaries blurred significantly. Frankl documented instances of decent Nazi guards.
Which sounds like an oxymoron.
Right, but these were men who would secretly smuggle food to prisoners at immense personal risk to their own lives, or who tried to shield inmates from the worst abuses.
While simultaneously, there were highly indecent prisoners. Specifically the capos.
Yes, the capos. These were prisoners who were elevated by the SS to supervisory roles over their fellow inmates.
Right.
In exchange for this power, the capos were often drastically more brutal, sadistic, and violent than the actual Nazi guards. They tortured their fellow prisoners for personal gain, for an extra scrap of sausage, or simply to maintain the illusion of safety with the SS.
So the environmental stimulus was exactly the same for the decent guard and the brutal capo.
Exactly.
But the choice of attitude, that choice between decency and indecency, remained entirely within their control.
Yes.
Let me stop you there, because the mechanics of that choice are what fascinate me. If you are freezing to death, if you haven't eaten in days, and you are offered extra food in exchange for beating another prisoner, the biological imperative screams at you to take the food.
Your body is begging you to do it.
Right, so how does a human being override that primal survival instinct to choose decency? Frankl leaned heavily on the philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche to explain this, specifically the quote, "He who has a why to live for can bear almost anyhow."
That why is the cognitive engine of survival. Frankl categorized two distinct trajectories for prisoners in the camps. The first group were those who lost faith in the future.
They lost their why.
Exactly. When they could no longer envision a meaningful future, they mentally collapsed. They ignored the challenge of life, gave up hope, and Frankl noted that these individuals almost always died of disease or starvation very shortly after the mental surrender.
Wow, so the mental state dictated the physical state.
The psychological collapse actively triggered the physical collapse. Their immune systems simply shut off.
But then there was a second group, the ones who viewed their existence, even in the absolute depths of the camp, as a challenge to be overcome. They identified a specific personal why.
And Frankl's own personal why is a brilliant case study in cognitive reframing.
It is entirely striking, because you would assume a prisoner's why would be primal. like getting back to a spouse or surviving just to exact bloody revenge on the guards.
Sure.
But Frankl did something vastly different. To survive the freezing marches and the starvation, he would vividly imagine himself standing in a well-lit, warm, comfortable university lecture hall in the future.
So specific.
He would visualize himself standing at a podium giving an academic lecture to an attentive audience about the psychology of the concentration camp he was currently suffering in.
It is an incredibly sophisticated psychological defense mechanism. Let's look at the mechanics of what he was doing there. By intensely visualizing himself, lecturing on his current experience in the future, his present unbearable suffering suddenly became objective.
It wasn't just pain anymore.
Right, it ceased to be merely senseless torture. He transformed it into a clinical observation, a data point, a learning event for a future audience.
That's brilliant.
Frankl famously wrote, "Suffering ceases to be suffering at the moment it finds a meaning." Because he assigned meaning to his pain, the meaning of surviving to Mead. To educate the world about the psychological limits of humanity, the suffering itself transformed into a task he could willingly undertake.
Okay, I have to step in and push back on this concept on behalf of the listener.
Go for it.
Because it is very easy for us to sit here in a comfortable studio with a cup of coffee and cheerfully say, just choose your attitude. Find the meaning in your pain when someone cuts us off in traffic.
Right, sure.
But applying this to profound, inescapable tragedy.
Yeah.
If someone loses a child or receives a terminal cancer diagnosis, telling them to choose their attitude feels dangerously close to toxic positivity. Doesn't this framework risk implying that if you are suffering, you just aren't trying hard enough to look on the bright side?
That is a highly valid critical challenge, and it's one Frankl had to navigate very carefully when establishing his clinical practice. We have to differentiate logotherapy entirely from the modern concept of toxic positivity.
How do you define the difference?
Toxic positivity demands that you actively suppress negative emotions, that you force a smile and feign happiness regardless of the reality. It's a denial of reality. Frankl's approach is the exact opposite.
Okay.
Logotherapy demands that you look unblinkingly at the absolute horror of your situation. You don't pretend it isn't awful, but you refuse to let that horror dictate your core identity.
It's not about finding a silver lining. It's about not letting the darkness consume your agency.
Exactly. It is not about being happy that you are suffering. It is about finding a defiant, resilient purpose despite the suffering. It is a gritty, boots-on-the-ground endurance. The goal isn't to feel good. The goal is to refuse to fade away into nothingness.
That distinction, the refusal to fade away versus the pursuit of happiness, is the exact pivot point where we transition from Frankl's survival story into the formal clinical architecture of his psychiatric framework. He didn't just write a profound memoir. He took these brutal survival mechanics and formalized them into a system to treat patients worldwide.
We are shifting now from the historical record of the camp into the medical theory that was birthed from it.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Because Frankl returned to Vienna, re-established his medical practice, and founded what officially became known as the Third Viennese School of Psychotherapy.
Yes.
He called it logotherapy, logos being the Greek word that denotes meaning.
And to grasp why logotherapy was such a revolutionary earthquake in the world of psychiatry, we have to look at the landscape he was stepping into. He was challenging the two massive, towering giants of Vienna who came before him.
Okay, set the stage for us.
The first Viennese school was founded by Sigmund Freud. Freudian psychoanalysis was fundamentally built on the mechanism of the will to pleasure. Freud argued that human beings are primarily driven by the desire to seek gratification and avoid pain, largely driven by unconscious primal urges.
Then you had the Second Viennese School, founded by Alfred Adler. Adler pivoted away from pleasure and argued that humans are primarily driven by the will to power. For Adler, human behavior is dictated by the need to overcome innate feelings of inferiority, driving us to seek dominance, status, or significance within society.
So Frankl returns from Auschwitz, looks at Freud's will to pleasure and Adler's will to power, and fundamentally argues that both of them are incomplete, if not entirely wrong, about the primary human drive.
And his evidence was his own experience.
His evidence was the concentration camp. Think about the mechanics of the camp. There is zero pleasure to be found, completely nullifying Freud. And there is zero power or dominance to be achieved, completely nullifying Adler.
Right.
If Freud and Adler were correct that pleasure and power are the primary engines of human survival, every single prisoner should have instantly laid down in the mud and died the moment they entered the gates.
But they didn't.
Because there was a deeper engine running in the background, Frankl posited that the primary, deepest, most fundamental drive of the human being is the will to meaning. Our primary motivation for living, for acting, and for enduring is the search to find meaning in our existence.
And he built the clinical practice of logotherapy upon 3 rigid core assumptions. Let's walk through them. The first assumption redefines the human anatomy. Frankl stated that the human being is an entity consisting of 3 distinct dimensions: a physical body, which he called soma, a psychological mind, which he called psyche, and a spiritual core, which he called nous.
But we need to clarify his use of the word spirit here because it trips people up. He wasn't talking about ghosts or strict religious theology.
Yeah, it's not a religious framework.
No, the nous, the spiritual dimension, is the uniquely human dimension. It houses our will to meaning, our conscience, our capacity for love, and our self-awareness. Frankl argued that while we have a body and we have a mind, the spirit is what we actually are. And medically, this was a massive breakthrough because Frankl argued that while the body can become diseased and the mind can become mentally ill, say, through severe clinical depression or schizophrenia, the spiritual core, the nous, remains healthy and untouched beneath the illness.
That is huge.
The therapist's job is to reach past the sick mind to awaken the healthy spirit.
That is a profoundly optimistic view of mental illness. Now, the second core assumption is that life has meaning in all ill circumstances, not just the good ones. Even in the most miserable, objectively terrible, inescapable situations, there is always a higher level of order that involves meaning, even if we can't fully comprehend it in the moment.
Which leads directly to the third assumption.
Yeah.
Humans possess the innate freedom to find that meaning. We are not purely deterministic machines driven by our genetics or our environment. We have the autonomy to respond to the demands of our daily life in ways that align with our conscience.
Okay, so logically the next question is how? How do we actually do that? If the primary drive of my life is to find meaning, where do I look?
Logotherapy proposes 3 distinct, actionable paths to discovering meaning in life. Let's break down the mechanics of each one.
Let's do it.
Path number 1 is the active path. Creating a work or doing a deed. This is about output. You find meaning by engaging in art, building a business, raising a child, tending a garden, or volunteering for a cause.
Tangible.
It is the act of doing something that leaves a tangible mark on the world that outlasts you. You extract meaning from your own creation.
Path number 2 is the receptive path. Experiencing something or encountering someone. You don't have to produce anything here. You find meaning simply through the profound experience of taking the world in.
Right, just being present.
This could be standing in awe of nature, deeply connecting with a piece of culture or art, or, most powerfully for Frankl, through the experience of love. It is the act of encountering another human being in their very core, recognizing their uniqueness and helping them actualize their potential.
But path number 3 is what makes logotherapy entirely unique from any other psychological framework. Path number 3 is the attitude we take toward unavoidable suffering.
Unavoidable is the key word there.
Yes. What happens when you are paralyzed and cannot create a work? What happens when you are locked in solitary confinement and cannot experience nature or love? How do you find meaning when you are stripped of the first 2 paths?
The rule is, when we are no longer able to change a situation, we are challenged to change ourselves.
Exactly. When the suffering is unavoidable, like an incurable disease or the death of a loved one, the meaning is found in the dignity, the courage, and the attitude with which we bear that suffering.
The sources provide a really poignant clinical example of this third path in action. Frankl tells an anecdote about an elderly general practitioner who came to his office in Vienna.
This is a classic logotherapy example.
It really is. This doctor was severely paralyzingly depressed because his wife, who he had loved deeply, had passed away a couple of years prior. He simply could not process the grief. He was destroying his life.
Now, think about how Freud would treat this man. Freud might dig into the man's childhood, looking for unconscious attachments. A modern psychiatrist might immediately prescribe heavy antidepressants to numb neurological pain receptors.
But Frankl didn't do either of those things.
No, he didn't analyze the man's past, and he didn't offer a pill. He simply asked him one hypothetical question.
He looked at the grieving doctor and asked, "What would have happened, doctor, if you had died first and your wife would have had to survive you?" And the old doctor immediately responded, "Oh, for her this would have been terrible, how she would have suffered."
And Frankl simply replied, "You see, doctor, such a suffering has been spared her, and it is you who have spared her this suffering. But now you have to pay for it by surviving and mourning her."
Let's look at the mechanics of what just happened in that room.
Yeah.
The objective reality did not change 1 millimeter. His wife was still dead. The immense, crushing weight of the grief was still present in the doctor's chest. But the doctor's internal attitude toward that grief shifted entirely. In an instant, his senseless suffering took on the profound meaning of a sacrifice.
He was bearing the pain for her.
He realized he was bearing this terrible pain so that the woman he loved didn't have to bear it. The moment he conceptualized his grief as a protective sacrifice, the clinical depression lifted. He shook Frankl's hand and left the office.
What's fascinating here is that Frankl did not cure the man's sadness. Logotherapy does not promise happiness. It completely rejects the idea that happiness is the primary goal of human existence.
That runs counter to basically everything we're taught today.
It does. In fact, Frankl argued vehemently that fulfillment and happiness fundamentally cannot be pursued directly.
It's the old adage, don't aim at success. The more you aim at it and make it a target, the more you miss it.
Because happiness and success must ensue. They are the unintended byproducts, the side effects of your personal dedication to a cause greater than yourself, or your absolute surrender to a person other than yourself.
You can't force it. If your primary goal in life is, quote, I want to be happy, you become entirely self-obsessed. You monitor your own mood constantly, and that hyper-focus paradoxically pushes happiness away. But if you aim for meaning, if you focus on helping someone else or building something valuable, happiness sneaks in the back door while you aren't looking.
Which perfectly bridges us to you, the listener, because unless you are tuning in from a highly unusual and unfortunate situation, you are not currently trapped in a 1940s concentration camp.
Safe to say.
If this framework is going to be truly useful, we need to transition this mid-century theory of extreme survival into the modern, everyday, seemingly mundane problems that we all face right now.
And Frankl was highly focused on this transition. He recognized that while the physical suffering of the Western world had decreased dramatically after the war, a new psychological plague was emerging. He diagnosed the modern world as suffering from a condition he called the existential vacuum.
The existential vacuum. Just a deep, echoing emptiness in the center of modern life. Explain the mechanics behind why we feel that way.
Well, Frankl argued that humanity has suffered a twofold loss in our development. First, unlike animals, modern humans have largely lost the basic, hardwired animal instincts that tell us exactly what we must do to survive. We don't have to hunt or forage daily.
Our basic needs are mostly met.
Second, as society rapidly modernized, we lost the strict societal traditions and rigid religious structures that historically told us what we ought to do.
So we don't have instincts telling us what we must do, and we don't have traditions telling us what we ought to do.
Exactly. So left entirely to our own devices with infinite choices, we suddenly don't know what we want to do. And Frankl noted that when people don't know what they want to do, they usually fall into one of two traps. They either do exactly what everyone else is doing, which is conformism, or they do whatever other people demand that they do, which is totalitarianism.
And when neither mindless conformity nor blind obedience satisfies the soul, the result is profound boredom. Frankl stated that boredom brings vastly more problems to modern psychiatrists than actual distress. He theorized that many of our modern societal issues, the soaring rates of clinical depression, crippling anxiety, widespread substance abuse, and even inexplicable societal aggression, are not root diseases.
They're just symptoms.
They are disguised existential angst. We are trapped in a vacuum of meaning, and we frantically try to fill that void with money, with power, with drugs, or with endless scrolling on our screens, but the vacuum remains entirely empty.
It is a compelling philosophical argument, but we don't just have to take Frankl's word for it. This isn't just mid-century musing. This has been rigorously and heavily researched. A massive 2016 systematic review of empirical research on logotherapy analyzed decades of data to see how these concepts hold up in modern clinical settings.
And what did they find?
The hard data is incredibly validating for Frankl's theories.
Let's look at the numbers. The data shows that an active search for meaning acts as a powerful, measurable resilience factor in human beings. Individuals who report a high sense of meaning in life consistently correlate with significantly higher overall life satisfaction and happiness.
It even correlates with higher marital satisfaction.
Clinical logotherapy programs have been proven highly effective in reducing severe job burnout and treating empty nest syndrome in older parents.
And it goes much deeper into clinical pathology. The measurable presence of meaning in a patient's life correlates with a drastically lower incidence of severe mental disorders.
Wow.
Logotherapy has been effectively deployed in specialized programs for early adolescents dealing with cancer diagnoses, helping them process the trauma. Most strikingly, it has been shown in controlled studies to effectively reduce active suicidal ideation in adult cancer patients.
That is incredible.
When a clinician can help a patient formulate a why, their actual physiological and psychological clinical outcomes improve.
So how do we action this data? What are the specific practical applications for the listener right now today? If we acknowledge that we are swimming in an existential vacuum, how do we consciously generate meaning to protect our psychology?
The sources outline a few highly specific strategies based directly on Frankl's work. Let's walk through the mechanics of each.
Okay, strategy 1.
First strategy is shoring. Create something. This taps into the active path we discussed earlier. Engaging in art, building a community project, writing a book, even cultivating a garden.
Doing something tangible.
Creating something requires you to project your vision into the future. It gives you a tangible sense of purpose that adds immediate weight and meaning to your daily life. You are actively choosing to leave a mark, however small, on your environment.
Second strategy. Find purpose in your pain. If you are going through a brutal season of life, try to consciously reframe a purpose for it, just like the grieving doctor. Let's say a family member is going through grueling, painful medical treatments, and you have to be their caretaker.
It's exhausting.
Instead of viewing yourself as a helpless, exhausted bystander, consciously frame your purpose as being the absolute, unshakable pillar of support for that person. Your exhaustion and your pain become the necessary price you pay to be their shield. It doesn't make the pain go away, but it makes the pain valuable.
Third strategy, focus outside yourself. When we feel stuck, anxious, or deeply depressed, our natural biological instinct is to turn inward. We isolate and we obsessively analyze our own negative feelings, creating a feedback loop of misery.
We get trapped in our own heads.
Frankl advises us to actively transcend that self-obsession. The fastest way out of your own head is to go help someone else. Volunteer at a shelter, focus on a cause, mentor someone. By forcing your attention outward onto the needs of others, you disrupt the internal feedback loop of anxiety.
Now, the fourth strategy is where logotherapy gets wonderfully bizarre, and I really want you to break down the mechanics of this because it sounds totally counterintuitive. It's called paradoxical intention. The strategy is accept the worst. Go seek out the thing you are terrified of.
Paradoxical intention is a brilliant cognitive intervention for breaking anticipatory anxiety. Let's say you have a severe phobia of sweating profusely during public speaking.
Okay.
What happens? You get up to the podium and you are terrified that you might sweat. That fear triggers your amygdala. The amygdala floods your body with adrenaline, the adrenaline raises your body temperature, and boom, you start sweating.
So the fear causes the thing you're afraid of.
Your fear of the symptom actually creates the symptom. Frankl called this hyperintention trying so hard to avoid something that you guarantee it happens, or trying so hard to achieve something like falling asleep that you make it impossible.
So how does paradoxical intention actually fix that?
By flipping the script, Frankl would tell the patient, when you go up to that podium, I want you to try to sweat as much as humanly possible. I want you to actively try to drown the front row in your sweat. Make it a competition to see how much you can perspire.
But wait, deliberately trying to sweat, how does that not just cause a massive panic attack on stage?
Because biologically, panic is fueled by your resistance to the fear. The anxiety requires you to be running away from the threat. The moment you turn around and actively, intentionally invite the threat in the moment you try to sweat, you remove the resistance.
Oh, well, that makes sense.
The anticipatory anxiety loses its target. The amygdala recognizes that you are no longer in danger because you are actively requesting the experience. The feedback loop breaks. The patient goes up to the podium, tries desperately to sweat, and finds they're completely dry because they successfully short-circuited the anxiety mechanism with humor and paradoxical intent.
That is fascinating neurological judo. But I have a modern dilemma here, a pushback for you on the entire philosophy of logotherapy. We currently live in a culture that is entirely obsessively dedicated to self-care, self-optimization, and chasing happiness as a direct metric.
Very true.
We have smartwatches that track our stress levels. We download apps to measure our daily bliss. We go on silent retreats solely to optimize our internal peace. If Frankl is right, and happiness can only be a byproduct of forgetting yourself and focusing outward on meaning, How do we navigate a modern world that is aggressively instructing us to do the exact opposite?
You've hit on the core friction between logotherapy and modern commercial psychology. Frankl would argue that our multi-billion-dollar obsession with self-care and self-optimization is actually the ultimate symptom of the existential vacuum.
Because we're hyper-focused on ourselves.
We are frantically, desperately trying to polish and optimize the self because we have absolutely nothing outside the self to live for. We're treating the symptom instead of the disease. The logotherapeutic approach would be radical today. It would tell you to stop tracking your mood, delete the happiness app, and start tracking your responsibilities to your community.
It's completely backward to how we live now.
It is a fundamental departure from mainstream, inward-looking self-help.
So what does this all mean? We spent the last hour looking at how powerful, how life-changing, and how practically applicable Frankl's system is. We've seen it rebuild lives. But in this deep dive, we promise to examine the entire picture, not just the highlights. And to the listener, we want to be very clear that we are impartially reporting these historical viewpoints. We aren't taking sides, just conveying the arguments.
Because the very attributes that make the book so incredibly inspiring and accessible to a layperson are the exact same attributes that set off massive alarm bells for academic historians and clinical psychologists.
Let's start with the clinical critiques, specifically the charge of authoritarianism. In 1961, Rollo May, who was a highly prominent, deeply respected existential psychologist, levied a very heavy public critique against logotherapy. May argued that logotherapy, in practice, hovers close to authoritarianism. Explain the mechanics of May's argument. Why did he think Frankl was dangerous?
Well, Rollo May's argument centered on the locus of control in therapy. May believed that true psychological healing requires the patient to do the agonizing, messy work of discovering their own internal meaning.
They have to figure it out for themselves.
May observed that logotherapy seemed to present neat, clear solutions to all problems, which belies the chaotic complexity of human life. His specific critique was that if a patient sitting in Frankl's office cannot find their own goal, Frankl simply steps in and supplies them with one.
May felt that by doing that, Frankl was essentially short-circuiting the patient's personal responsibility. Instead of the patient building their own philosophical foundation, the therapist acts like a supreme authority figure, just handing him a meaning, like a pharmacist handing over a prescription.
Right.
May was particularly disturbed by Frankl's use of categorical instructions. Frankl would frequently tell patients definitively, don't do this, or you must do that. May compared this rigid directive style to the dictates of a fundamentalist religion where the guru hands down the law.
And this critique of his methodology ties directly into criticisms of Frankl's own personality and ego.
Oh, really?
The historical sources note that peers frequently referred to Frankl as a brilliant prima donna. There was an undeniable grandiosity to his self-image.
Do we have examples of that?
Frankl himself once enthusiastically described treating a patient suffering from severe obsessive-compulsive neurosis, and he recounted the experience by saying, "I had a feeling like she is mud in my hands, and I was creating a new person."
Mud in my hands. That is a shockingly godlike way for a therapist to view a vulnerable patient. It validates Rollo May's fears perfectly.
It absolutely does. But we have to look at Frankl's defense. Frankl fiercely defended himself against May's critique, and his defense was rooted in his identity as a physician.
He was a medical doctor first.
Exactly. He argued that he wasn't just a philosopher, he was a medical doctor treating acute distress. If a medical doctor encounters a patient bleeding out, they don't ask the patient to philosophically discover how to stop the bleeding.
They apply a tourniquet.
Frankl argued that recommending exactly what a patient should or shouldn't do for their psychological recovery, or giving them a highly optimistic prognosis to instill hope, isn't authoritarianism. It's the fundamental duty of medicine. He gladly took the blame for being overly directive if it meant the patient didn't commit suicide.
You can certainly understand Frankl's pragmatism there, but you can also see exactly why the secular psychological establishment remained deeply suspicious of him. Especially because, in the 1950s, logotherapy was rapidly adopted by religious institutions.
It really caught on in those circles.
It became incredibly popular with pastoral psychologists and Methodist ministers. There was even a highly successful book published titled Jesus and Logotherapy. And, whenever a secular psychological theory starts being utilized as a theological tool by religious institutions, the hard science community tends to back away slowly.
But the controversies don't stop at his clinical style. There is also significant, highly charged academic pushback regarding the narrative of the book itself. specifically targeting Frankl's interpretation of the Holocaust and the mechanics of who survived.
Right. Let's look at the critique from academic Richard Middleton Kaplan, again, impartially reporting here. He argued that Frankl's central, most inspiring thesis, that a positive attitude and a strong sense of meaning kept you alive, carries a very dark, deeply offensive, unintentional implication.
Middleton Kaplan lays out the logic. If we accept Frankl's premise that a positive attitude and a focus on meaning are what kept people alive, then logically we are inadvertently implying that the millions of people who died simply lacked the right attitude.
That's a horrifying thought.
It implies that those who perished in the gas chambers simply gave up or didn't have a strong enough why. Middleton Kaplan argues this framework dangerously feeds into the offensive historical myth that victims went like sheep to the slaughter. It borders on victim blaming, suggesting that survival was a matter of psychological willpower rather than the brutal, random mechanics of industrial genocide.
Then you have Holocaust analyst Lawrence L. Langer, who attacked the tone of the book. Langer accused Frankl of writing with an air of self-aggrandizement and possessing an inhumane sense of studying detachment toward the victims.
Right.
Langer felt that Frankl was too analytical, treating the genocide of his peers merely as a fascinating psychological data set, rather than acknowledging the visceral, chaotic reality of the slaughter.
And we must also acknowledge the most severe, controversial criticisms, which came from psychiatrists Thomas Szasz and Holocaust historian Raoul Hilberg. They levied incredibly harsh claims against Frankl.
What did they claim?
They argued that Frankl's testimony and his polished narrative of finding meaning were actually transparent efforts to conceal his own actions or collaboration while in the camps. Szasz went so far as to compare Frankl's memoirs to those of Benjamin Wilkomirski, whose famous Holocaust memoir was ultimately exposed as a complete fabrication.
Though the sources are very quick to aggressively clarify that Szasz's analogy is deeply flawed and heavily disputed by mainstream scholars.
Yes, that's crucial to point out.
There is absolutely zero doubt in the historical record that Viktor Frankl was a prisoner, that he suffered immensely, and that he was a survivor of the camps. His physical presence and suffering there are undeniable historical facts.
This raises an important question, though, regardless of those specific extreme claims. It raises the question about the limits of an impartial first-person perspective when representing a situation as extreme as the Nazi extermination. Memory, especially under extreme, sustained trauma, is wildly complex and notoriously unreliable.
And we have to address the reality of survival bias. Survival in the camps often correlated with pure instinctual opportunism, moral compromises, and sheer dumb luck, just as much, if not more, than it did with positive thinking.
Luck played a massive role.
If you were randomly selected to go left instead of right off the train, you lived. Frankl's psychological framework is undeniably brilliant, but it is ultimately subject to that survival bias. Because he survived, he naturally believes that the specific cognitive mechanisms he utilized were the reason he survived. He projects his successful coping mechanism onto the entire ecosystem.
Exactly. This debate perfectly highlights the inherent tension of the book. There is a massive tension between viewing man's search for meaning as a deeply inspiring, life-saving psychological tool versus viewing it as a strictly objective historical document of the Holocaust.
It's hard to hold both views at once.
It can be a profound, effective catalyst for personal healing in the modern world, while still having massive, problematic blind spots regarding the macro reality and the sheer randomness of the genocide it describes.
Which brings us to the synthesis of our deep dive today. We have traced an incredible, harrowing path. We started in the unimaginable suffering and freezing mud of Auschwitz, dissecting how the brain uses apathy as a shield, and how the sudden removal of trauma can cause the psyche to self-destruct.
We covered a lot of ground.
We explored the profound realization that the ultimate untouchable human freedom is the microscopic gap between a stimulus and our chosen attitude. We've witnessed the birth of logotherapy, challenging Freud and Adler by proving that the will to meaning is our primary engine.
Yes.
We looked at the mechanics of creating, experiencing, and reframing suffering to combat the existential vacuums of our modern, hyper-optimized lives. And finally, we looked unblinkingly at the academic shadows, the concerns about authoritarian therapy, victim blaming, and survival bias.
It is a profoundly complex legacy, full of contradictions, but it remains an undeniably powerful architecture for human resilience.
Before we go, I want to leave you with one final fascinating detail from Frankl's later life that perfectly encapsulates his entire worldview. Frankl firmly believed that freedom is only half of the equation. He wrote extensively that freedom is in danger of degenerating into mere arbitrariness unless it is lived in terms of responsibleness.
Freedom without a corresponding responsibility just devolves into chaos and selfishness.
Exactly. So he took this idea very literally. He actually recommended that the Statue of Liberty on the East Coast of the United States, representing freedom, should be physically supplemented by a Statue of Responsibility built on the West Coast.
I love that idea.
He envisioned a massive physical monument to remind society that liberty must always be balanced with duty to others. And this wasn't just a pipe dream. A Utah sculptor named Gary Lee Price actually designed the monument and gained significant traction and endorsements to get it built.
It is a brilliant, tangible metaphor for his whole philosophy.
Yeah.
You possess the absolute freedom to choose your response to the world, but you carry the heavy responsibility to ensure you choose a meaningful one. Which leaves us with a final thought to mull over as we end this deep dive.
What's that?
Well, we spend so much time in our modern lives asking what we expect out of life. What is life going to give me? When will I get my break? When will I finally be happy? Frankl asks us to flip that script completely.
He demands that we flip it.
He asks you to consider, what if you completely stopped asking what you want from life and instead got very quiet and listened closely to what life is currently demanding of you?
That's a tough shift to make.
It is. Whether that demand is manifesting through a personal crisis you have to navigate, a struggling relationship that requires your patience, or a creative calling you've been ignoring. If you truly listened to what life was asking you to do, rather than what you want life to give you, how would your actions change tomorrow morning?
Are you just going to keep tracking your happiness metrics? Or are you willing to wade into the messy, muddy waters of reality and drop an anchor of meaning? Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Keep seeking meaning in the chaos.